let me, therefore, begin the second lecture of this series, which is called The Last Year of the Old Order, Israel and the Jews, 1962 to 66. Tonight's the second lecture, which is From the Basement to the Closet, Israel and the A-Bomb, 1962-66. And that's what happened. It moved from the basement to the closet. And remember, Israel, till this day, has never come out and openly said they have an atomic bomb, so it doesn't exist. So I have to start with a Chazara shir a little bit, and I imagine some of you were not here, and some of you were here, and I hope you'll remember some of this. Actually, I hope you don't remember any of this. But to set the context, I'm going to take it back to the beginning. And obviously the beginning is this, right? The A-bomb, when it blew up in Hiroshima, and that introduced the world to what that did. Before that, nobody knew what was happening. The world was horrified, but some people were fascinated. Even before Israel became a state in 1948, particularly this guy, Ernst David Bergman, who became the father of the Israeli A-bomb in a certain sense, in the same way that Einstein was the father of the American A-bomb, even though he wasn't. But nevertheless, he's like the spiritual influence that created the background for making the atomic bomb, which won us the war, I might remind you. And here's Ernst David Bergman was the son of a conservative rabbi in Berlin, and he became a big Zionist, totally secular. He turns back on his family's conservative Judaism, and moved to Israel eventually. In the beginning, he hooked up with Chaim Weizmann, and then he switched from Weizmann to Ben-Gurion, which means that Weizmann was into pure science, and Ben-Gurion certainly was not into pure science. Ben-Gurion was into applied science, and he had the applications in mind. And that is who they are. And the Weizmann never forgave him. It's a ganze story over there. But by the time you come to the late 40s, he has transferred his star from this physicist, who, by the way, he published 500 papers. I mean, he wasn't a nobody. And he transferred his star to the rising Ben-Gurion. And already in 46, 47, 48, it's amazing. He and Ben-Gurion are talking about one day they'll be in Israel, and one day Israel will have an A-bomb. You understand what I'm saying? It predates the 1948. Simply because, of course, they were dreaming, but Ben-Gurion realized at that time what we all know today, which is it's the ultimate weapon. Now, as I say, he interests Ben-Gurion in it, so although he didn't talk about it in public, but from very early time on, Ben-Gurion, although he wouldn't say it, but in his coy kind of way, was always interested in this kind of subject, which you'll see in the following brief news video when he goes and pays a visit to Albert Einstein, strictly to talk about, the state of kashrus in Baltimore.
Prime Minister Ben-Gurion of Israel arrives at Princeton, New Jersey to call on Dr. Albert Einstein, one of the world's greatest scientists, the father of relativity and the man whose physics formula led the way to the atomic explosion, plays host to the leader who played a great part in the creation of the Israeli nation. Here are two men, one whose imprint will be written deep in the history of social progress, and the other who helped found a new age, a meeting to remember.
What a different PR atmosphere it was in those days. They called Ben-Gurion a man of social history. If you know, when Chaim Weizmann died in 1952, Ben-Gurion really pressured Einstein to become the president of Israel. And the reason he did was for the prestige, but in the back of his mind, you understand the fact that he had the father of nuclear science, there's no question in my mind. He figured once he's there, he'll be in Israel, in between the third and the fourth cup at the Seder, they'll bring up, and what about? But on the other hand, Ben-Gurion wanted to be a secret. He was no dummy. He was the opposite of a dummy. And he knew it would set up an arms race, and that the Middle East would become more dangerous to Israel than before. In other words, of the various scenarios, it would go like this. Nobody has a bomb. Israel has a bomb, and the Arabs don't. Everybody has a bomb. Israel and the Arab state. The third one is a disaster. That's the one we're facing now. Correct? Because if everybody has nuclear weapons, sooner or later somebody will shoot at each other, and Israel will go down the tubes. So it's better for no one to have, but Ben-Gurion wanted, in a certain way, that Israel should have, and the Arabs shouldn't have. But it has to be secret. His general outlook, Ben-Gurion's, I'm talking about, was very complicated. There were two or three people inhabiting him. The socialist side of him persuaded him that one day the Arabs would accept Israel. This is why Ben-Gurion was so interested when Nasser came to power, because he thought that this is a socialist also. I'm talking about 1952, 53, 54. There's a famous speech that Ben-Gurion gives in the Knesset welcoming the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, looking forward to a progressive regime in Egypt, and then we'll cooperate with the progressive socialist system in Israel to find some kind of solution for the Arab-Israeli dispute, blah, blah, blah. And I think in some way, just to sleep at night, Ben-Gurion had to have a side of him when he led the Jews into independent statehood and permanent war with the Arabs. You hear what I said? Permanent war with the Arabs. There had to be a side of him that said it's not going to be permanent. That one day, a great leader somewhere or other will arise out of the Arabs who will act logically and do peace with Israel. That was his socialist side. On the other hand, the Jew in Ben-Gurion persuaded the Arabs will never accept Israel, as Israel needs an equalizer, and there you have the famous position of the atomic bomb, like Shimshon. If the worst come to worst, and the Arabs overwhelm us, we'll take the whole place down, like Samson and the Philistines. You understand? If that's what it is, we'll do it. And because it won't be another Holocaust, at least, meaning we won't go down like sheep. We might go down, we'll take everybody with us. So this is the mentality. See, he was a complicated guy. As they say, the secular socialist side thought of science in a creative way. The Jew in him and the other said like this, the Arabs will never make peace with Israel. But he vacillated between the two sides of his character. I think as Nasser played out, he saw that the Jewish side, unfortunately, was the accurate one. The key word in everything was secrecy, and Ben-Gurion is associated with a highly secret regime. In his time, I remind you, as I have on a number of occasions in these talks, he owned the radio, and his newspaper was one of the biggest in Israel, and there was censorship, and there still is. I'll say it again. There's official censorship of the Israeli media. Doesn't mean that much because the foreign media now with the internet and everything can run around it, but especially in those days, before you had all those technological innovations, it was possible to control the news. And all the newspapers felt, except the communists, all the newspapers that they have to play ball in national defense. It's very fascinating from a certain social historical perspective that in the late 50s and the early 60s, as we will see, many in Israel knew about the secret A-bomb project because they do. You know, Jews have cousins and uncles and where are you working in Dimona and all this. You know, it is. But we don't talk about it. You understand? Certainly not with their children there and no one else is there. So it was a public self-censorship, you see, which is actually very good for pursuing national security goals. You can't get that today in Israel. Forget it. But they did it that. It's one of the things that differentiates the Ben-Gurion era from the post-Ben-Gurion era. The fact that everybody voluntarily shut up. And believe me, when Ben-Gurion would make I still remember this when I'm a little kid, and when Ben-Gurion would make a speech and would say, oh, we're just producing, gefilte fish there or something like this. And I know I remember the old guys, into my father and the other people that say, oh yeah, talking Yiddish. We know what kind of gefilte fish they're making over there and so forth. But shh, everybody was part of this kind of conspiracy. Now, the early years of Israel, therefore, could be characterized as a kind of a national cult of secrecy. And here was the troika that ran the country, Ben-Gurion and Shimon Peres and Dayan. And Harel was the head of had a unique position. He headed all the security agency. I'm not sure. I don't want to call it the Beria of Israel, but because they weren't like that. But nevertheless, he controlled the FBI and the CIA. We've never had that in this country. Someone controls both the internal security organization and the external security. So he had tremendous power. So if anybody really wanted to blow the whistle on something, they could arrest him without a trial. And once in a while they did that. And they could close down a newspaper. And once in a while they did that. And he could go to people in parliament and say, don't talk about this. And they would listen. So it's a different era in the history of Jewish people. But it's totally understandable. Israel itself was shocked that they ever became a state. And a few years before it was Hitler. So don't rock the boat. You understand? Does everybody understand? We're lucky to be here. Don't rock the boat. Now, the guy who was the father of the A-bomb project, Ernst Bergman, David Bergman, by contrast, was a big mouth. That's who he was. He was a ploppler. Whenever he went to international conferences, it's crazy. I mean, he would meet someone and say, we're in Israel. We're interested in nuclear thing. Maybe one day we'll have an A-bomb and all this, which drove, of course, Ben-Gurion crazy. And eventually they had to sort of like sideline him. The 1950s was an era, the 50s, was an era when the nuclear weapons were spreading, no matter what anybody said. I didn't make a chart, but the USA got an H-bomb in 52. The Russians got an H-bomb, a hydrogen bomb, which is 1 million times stronger, in 53. Britain in 52 and 58. In 52, England made its own A-bomb, and in 58 made its own H-bomb. France, 1960 and 1968, just to give you the years. And I left out China. So you can't say that this is a time when nobody was doing anything. The big nations weren't asking anybody's permission. England didn't say, let's ask about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Prime Minister of England, and they couldn't afford it because England was broke at the time, said, we're going to have a hydrogen bomb. Right? And same thing with France and the other countries. So this became, in the international political mentality of that time, something that a big nation wants to have. Right or wrong. Now, I told you last year, that the specific case of Israel was one in which, from early on, they attached themselves to the French efforts, starting around 1950, that's right after Israel became a state, to create atomic energy and atomic bomb. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but I want you to understand, Israel sent physicists and young students to study at French institutes and French places where they were developing this stuff in 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, and so on and so forth. And since they were bright, young Jewish students, they did pull their weight. So they weren't simply standing there and watching what the French were doing, but they were contributing ideas, solving problems, being constructive members of it, and the French liked them. At that time, as you will perhaps recall from what we did last year, France and Israel were tight. And the French liked the Israelis, and therefore they didn't feel like they're breaching their own national security. It's quite remarkable. They didn't feel they're breaching their own national security by allowing Israelis in on the core projects. But on the contrary, this we keep away from the public and from the other countries. Israel is special because Israel is a young country. They're pro-French. They're against Nasser, who was against the France at that time, and they're Democrats. And anyway, the French also had a little bit of a guilt complex. Not that much, but a little bit of guilt for helping Hitler in the war, Vichy France, Marshal Pétain. And so these all things came together in such a way to allow Israel to have an unusual and intimate connection with the French project, which is something Ben-Gurion pushed. Specifically, in 1956, you will recall, it was the Sinai campaign, and in that context, the French approached Shimon Peres. And I told you, Shimon Peres at that time, every week was in Paris. Flew back and forth every week, 40 times a year. Think about what I'm saying. Paris was quite remarkable. And he was very tight with all the big French politicians, all the ones that counted. And these two guys were very good friends of his. Mollet was the prime minister, and then later on, Bourges-Monnery was the prime minister, and he was the defense minister beforehand. And I just picked two pictures out of many. But these were the guys who counted. These were French prime ministers before the Gaulle era. So they had the Fourth Republic and not the Fifth Republic. At that time, the governments were shaky, and therefore every few months they switched and became a new prime minister and a new other minister, which means that the bureaucrats ran the country. You understand? That's what that means. France did not cease because they switched coalitions all the time, but rather the French ran by the middle-level guys and the lower-level guys who ran the day-to-day operations. And Peres became very tight with all of them. They approached him. If Israel wants to attack Nasser in the Sinai campaign, you understand, this wasn't an idea Israel dreamed up. It's the French went to Shimon Peres, and they said, if we go to war with Nasser, will Israel join? And if you will recall, Peres right away said yes, and then asked Ben-Gurion if he said the right thing, and Ben-Gurion said yes, but only after making certain conditions. And one of the conditions was that if Israel will go to war against Egypt, it's going to get Eisenhower angry, and so France won't leave Israel in the lurch. You get it? They won't let the UN boycott them and whatever, and they won't let America beat them up, and so on and so forth. In other words, France will stick with it, and so will England. This was the secret, dirty deal that led to the Treaty of Sèvres, that led to the agreement there. There was a plot that launched the Sinai campaign. So that Israel invaded the Sinai Desert, and the French acted horrified. It's all part of the scenario. And the French said, we will come in with a French army to separate the two sides, which is France's way of taking over the Suez Canal, etc., etc. Now, Lamaisa, it didn't work, as you know. And the invasion didn't go off right. And Eisenhower blew a top. And he threatened England and France with soft power, cutting off American money or the stock market, things like this. And England and America England and France folded like a house of cards. Like a house of cards. And they told Israel, the French, they said, we know we promised all the rest of it. Circumstances change. You understand? And Paris said, will you give us our word? And the Prime Minister of France, Guy Mollet and Bourges-Monnery, they said, we feel real bad about it. And they did. Felt real bad about it. What can we do to make it up? And Shimon Peres like this, I have an idea. Okay? And out of that came the French support for Israel atomic energy. They never used the word atomic bomb. France itself did not have an atomic bomb yet. France was working on it and got it in 1960. I just want you to understand. The late 50s, therefore, is a time when the French also were working on it. And so what Israel said was, will you help us, as only a great power can, to build the factories and set up all the infrastructure and the new technological machines that we go over there. Because how to create an atomic bomb was known ever since 1945. It wasn't contrary to popular belief, it wasn't some kind of super secret the way you imagine in some kind of a comic book. The necessary infrastructure to do all this stuff was the hard thing. And that was beyond the capacity for most normal countries, including Israel. So if France agreed, and by the way, Israel said, like, we will pay you for every bit. This cost millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars. They paid France for everything, but still for France to condescend and do this was done in the context of a payback because they left Israel in the lurch in 1956. It's quite a story. If you recall, it wasn't clear because Guy Mollet fell for power, and then it was another prime minister, and then this guy was the prime minister, who was his very good friend of Shimon Peres, and he was there for a month or two, and then the whole Fourth Republic collapsed, and de Gaulle came in. And at the last moments of the Fourth Republic, it's remarkable. Shimon Peres went into the French cabinet room. They let a foreigner, and he said, can we get this thing signed now? And the last thing the Prime Minister Bourges-Monnery did before the government resigned was the cabinet should officially vote to confirm this deal with Israel. You know, and Peres was able, and he was sitting in the room outside as like, congratulations, it's a baby. So the consequence, the context is quite extraordinary. The deal, when it came, was not popular in Israel among the Israeli elites, even among the limited circles that were aware of it. Here are three ferocious opponents of the A-bomb project. Yeah, maybe you've heard of them, right? Okay. Now, people like Golda Meir was the foreign minister. I say. Moshe Dayan was head of the army. And Eshkol was in charge of the money, the finance minister. These were the three top people under Ben-Gurion. And they were all committed to blocking this program, which they saw as something terrible. The country can't afford it. It's a bad idea. It'll promote American anger. It'll get the Arabs will try to make their own. There are 100 good reasons why it couldn't happen. So in any ordinary situation, the cabinet and all the others were voted against it. Ben-Gurion rammed it through. This is what like I told you last year. Ben-Gurion at the high noon. This was when he was the boss, and here's an example of it. Everybody was against him, of all the elites, and him and Peres rammed it through. They said, we're doing this, and that's it. Now, Eshkol, who was in charge of the money, he said like this, you're talking about something's going to cost 50, 60, 70, actually $80 million at that time. Think about what that is. It's $1950, so whatever it is by today. And Israel is poor. This is before startup nation. Israel is poor. We can't afford this. You're going to take bread out of the people. You understand? How are you going to... In other words, that's what he said. It's an insane idea. Theoretically, it's interesting, but it's like dreaming about the moon. And Ben-Gurion said like this, we'll raise the money off the books. Right? We'll raise the money another way. And what he did was he made a phone call, Abe, and he called this guy, Abe Feinberg, who I mentioned last year. He was the big money Democratic Party fundraiser and all behind it, and a super Zionist. Okay, we will come across him before we're done tonight. And basically, we don't have they weren't stupid enough to keep a record of the telephone conversation by saying, it's Abe. I need $80 million. and 85%, and by the way, $80 million, not tax deductible. You get what I'm saying? No, this is not going to be through the UJA. Nobody knows about this. No, I'm serious. That's an extra money. And so when 85% did like this, he said, okay, he put together Rolodex, and he started calling people like this. Remember Joe Meyerhoff? Isaac Wolfson, I remember, gave $5 million at that time. At that time. So that's what he called Wolfson Towers, right? What do you call it? Bronfman also gave $5 million. That's the old man, the father. And so if you get together, if everybody, now I don't think everybody gave $5 million, but I'll bet you everybody gave not less than $1 million. So it's nice when you can put together a little group like that, and then the shul doesn't have to have a mortgage. Okay? And so, by the way, this is why nobody knew. It wasn't, they probably cut checks to some Swiss bank account or something like that. This is how they did it. You understand? It wasn't reported in the usual charitable contributions. It is quite a story. We will never know, because they were smart. We will never know what exactly happened. And, there wasn't a trail and all that kind of business. But it happened. And they raised some incredible amount of money. Not overnight. And this didn't happen instantly and so easily, but it did happen. And without this, Ben Gurion said like this has nothing to do with this is out of a separate fund, This is what they call the rabbi's discretionary fund, okay? So all during the years. So if you want to understand what's going on in Israel behind the scenes, not in front of the movie cameras, all during the years 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, and 63. In the last 5 years of the Ben Gurion era, Ben Gurion and Shimon Peres blithely disregard the opposition as well as the reluctance of the Israeli scientists to help. Not the entire, but a major part of the Israeli scientific community was violently opposed to this. They said it can't happen, it's a misuse of resources, and anyway, it's a terrible weapon, and this and that and the other. And some people have moral qualms, some financial qualms, some people have scientific qualms, and the Israeli scientists wouldn't cooperate. You get it? And Shimon Peres had to go and try to make speeches. He says, you guys should help the national defense effort, and this, that, and the other. That's how America first got the first whiff of it, because he gave a closed speech to a bunch of scientists that we need you to help to contribute your know-how in this project, and 1 or 2 or 3 or 20 of the scientists called the American Embassy. You see? So this is, you don't understand what a matter of political will we're talking about over here. Really is one of the hallmarks of the Ben Gurion era, because he said, I guess we're doing this, and he just crushed all the opposition. Now Bergman, who I mentioned before, since he was a big mouth, was put aside and in favor of 2 guys who know how to keep their mouth shut. And these are the 2 guys who ran the operation. Munya Mardor and Shalhevet Fryer. Fryer's father was, a conservative rabbi in Germany, which is just interesting. And his mother was Recha Fryer, who had made the youth aliyah. So these are people from very Zionist kind of background. The fact to give him a name in Germany, Shalhevet, give me a break, And he had brothers also with these crazy Hebrew names. I'm talking about Germany in the 1920s. This was not done. His name was Adolf or something like that, right? And Mardor is exactly from Haganah, that type. Back in the 30s and 40s, they're the ones that did all the Haganah stuff and the secret weapons acquisition. And so Ben Gurion put 2 veteran people, behind the project with the idea, still, but get it done. And already, since the early 50s, as I say, they had a group of scientists who were cooperating. These were Israelis who worked in the French project. Now, one of the main reasons the French let them in 1950 is the French were behind and needed all help they could. And the number 1 French nuclear scientist, the only Frenchman who worked in Los Alamos with Robin Oppenheimer and the other group, happened to be this guy. Okay? Notice, a Jewish Jew, Bertrand Goldschmidt. He became France's most famous nuclear scientist of the mid-20th century. And he wasn't one of these French guys who turned his back on his Jewish background, because after all, he lived through Vichy. You understand? He lived through the 30s, all the anti-Semitism. So all these guys have been inoculated against self-denial. And consequently, he's like this, I want to help France. And get me straight, this guy helped France get the A-bomb. But I also want to help Israel too. So it's, the human story is quite interesting. Starting in 58, after they got all the money and everything together, they start building the Dimona infrastructure, as we all know. It will be a bomb using plutonium and heavy water, not the uranium. Don't ask me to explain all that, because I can't. Ben-Gurion does not tell America. That's clear. Ben-Gurion does not tell Eisenhower, which Golda Meir said is suicide. If you try to fool the Americans, you're playing with fire. Well, that's not how Ben-Gurion saw it. Okay? Now, I told you last year that it wasn't so simple. Eisenhower does know through his own way, but he chooses to keep silent because of the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Admiral Strauss. Ben-Gurion didn't. No, this is so typical of Eisenhower. Ben-Gurion's telling us, we're not doing anything in Dimona. It's garnished. Eisenhower knew from the YouTube, for the U2. Sigmund Freud, where are you? I knew from the U-2 planes what's going on over there, but Admiral Strauss told him, he said, don't say anything, and he didn't. This is a move that Eisenhower chose to make. France, meanwhile, in 58 and 59, switched to the much less friendly de Gaulle, the Fifth Republic of General de Gaulle. Here's this guy really hated Israel. De Gaulle was 50-50. But Couve de Morville, who was the foreign minister almost the entire de Gaulle period, was an old-line French diplomat who was pro-Arab and all the rest of it. And the French were not happy with what was going on. De Gaulle came in and said, yes, who let the Israelis into our innermost secrets and all this? Why are we helping them? But Paris and Ben-Gurion persuaded them to continue the aid, which is an amazing piece of diplomacy. Call it whatever you want. Okay? Here's that picture I showed you last year. Ben-Gurion coming to the Élysée Palace in 1959, and he did the same thing in 1960. And we will never know what happened exactly behind the closed doors. De Gaulle does talk about it a little bit in his memoirs, but the bottom line was, he says, continue the aid, and the contracts had been signed and the money had been paid. And so he said, on that basis, let it go. And if you really, really, really care, you'll find something quite remarkable. It was a different France at that time. And de Gaulle actually gave orders in 59 and in 60 and in 61 to halt all the aid to Israel on the atomic stuff, and the French bureaucrats did not listen. It was a different country. You know what I said? The minister in the cabinet was Jacques Sustel, and after him another guy, and the lower level guys, they simply didn't listen. So it's not what people imagine when you see countries and governments and all the rest of it. A lot depends on what happens at the lower level. And Shimon Peres is amazing. He had built up such a network of sympathizers and admirers that no matter what de Gaulle said, they went ahead and did it. So it's remarkable. At the end of Eisenhower's administration in 1960, a Jewish scientist, naturally, a physicist from Michigan, named Henry Gomberg, went to Israel for something, and he lets the cat out of the bag. He was a Jewish American, so he was Jewish, and in fact he went to Israel. It shows he was interested in Israel, but he was American first. And the kind of questions that his colleagues asked him as a scientist, he wasn't a dummy. And so he went to the American embassy, and he said, yes, they're putting together an A-bomb. I don't know if you know this or not. And the American ambassador said, just keep your mouth shut, get on the plane, and go back to Switzerland, to America, and tell them. And he did do so. Now, what that means is the following, that this guy came back and informed the State Department and the CIA that Israel, in his opinion, is working on an A-bomb. So here you have now a funny picture, which I say people don't understand often unless you study these things very closely. A government is like a hydra. It's a bunch of different heads. And very often it's the case that one part of the government doesn't know what the other part of the government is doing. And that's how Israel operated the Ben-Gurion era. And so here you have the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower knew from day one, thanks to the U-2 flights. Right? I got to watch myself. He says, but he knew what's happening. But he didn't tell, actually, and Dulles and Alan Dulles, the top guys knew also. They didn't tell the people below them. So the bureaucracy has its own culture and its own life. Now the story hits the bureaucracy. You get what I'm saying? He told the ambassador to Israel. He flew him to America. It was debriefed by the CIA and by the State Department. Now the middle guys know what's going on, or at least, let's put it this way, they don't know what's going on, but they have a report from a scientist, a Jewish scientist. This is what's going on. Now, in the real world of intelligence, and we may have people in this audience that work there, There's various levels of credibility, I say. Just because somebody says something doesn't mean it's true. A genuine intelligence agency like the CIA wants verification, and unless they have evidence right in front of their face, it'll take quite a while before they reach a bureaucratic consensus that this is what's happening. Okay? Just for example, consider how prior to 9/11 there was not a consensus over the nature of the Islamic terrorism in the Clinton or the Bush administrations. Then there was after 9/11, and so that is the nature of the beast. Now there was a big meeting of the Secretary of State and the head of the CIA and the head of the Atomic Energy Commission in the last months of Eisenhower. I'm talking of here like November, December of 1960, when the elections were already over and Kennedy had been in, Eisenhower's administration very late in the day, and they called the Israeli ambassador, all the rest of it, and it got leaked these suspicions got leaked to the New York Times, and from then to the rest of the world, but it never went beyond the point of suspicion. Ben-Gurion said like this: "There are no atomic bombs. It's a kitan. It's a textile factory, and they provide employment for the Sephardic immigrants, and so on and so forth. And these guys say to the Israeli ambassador, we want inspection rights, but they're too low level to do anything." And Eisenhower went out by January 20th of 61 without ever saying anything, which is, if you understand what's going on, that speaks volumes. Now, people don't get it. I saw in this interview, I was telling my wife, with the Dennis Ross, Eisenhower's administration was a terrible administration of Israel. I don't know what he's talking about. But if you read the superficial way, it's there. There's no question in my mind, and all you ever get is my opinion, that Eisenhower went out completely, even though he knew that Israel was working on an A-bomb, which means that you're making a special case for Israel, but he made a special case for Israel for the following simple reason.
At this concentration camp in the Goda area, the Germans starved, clubbed, and burned to death more than 4,000 political prisoners over a period of 8 months. A few captives survived by hiding in the woods. The camp is chosen for a high command inspection led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Also present are Generals Omar and Bradley and George S. Patton. The 4th Armored Division of General Patton's 3rd Army liberated this camp early in April. The generals viewed the rack that was used by the Nazis to whip the inmates.
People forget, that Eisenhower was the only president who saw the concentration camps. And they think that this had no effect. Actually, I'm wrong. 1 month after this, in June of 1945, when the war was totally over, and the Americans had won, a delegation from Congress, senators and congressmen, about 30 of them, came to visit defeated Germany, and they went to see this also. It wasn't cleaned up yet. And one of those members of Congress was Congressman Lyndon Baines Johnson. And he never wrote about it, but his wife did. You understand? And people don't understand this, but you will before tonight's over, I hope. The point is that Eisenhower went out without saying anything, and Ben-Gurion was worried about the new administration. But the question then becomes like this: what kind of person is John F. Kennedy? Because people were wondering, is he an anti-Semite like his father? Because there's no question about the old man. But anyway, the point is like this. When we talk about John F. Kennedy, it's very fascinating because he reminds me very much of Obama. And that is because Kennedy had a certain cognitive dissonance as far as Israel is concerned. He wasn't an anti-Semite, as far as I could tell, but he wasn't pro-Zionist at all, quite the opposite. Kennedy wrote in his hotel room in May of 1948 that Truman did a terrible thing and recognized Israel. Kennedy, you have to understand, was the son of a diplomat, among other things. He totally absorbed a lot of State Department attitudes towards Zionism in Israel. He was fighting the Cold War, and he saw Israel as a negative factor in the Cold War. And yet, although he never ever spoke about it, he knew about the Holocaust too. And moreover, Kennedy's whole campaign and persona as president was based on the famous traditional Roosevelt New Deal Democratic coalition, of which the Jews were an essential element. And most of his money when he ran in 1960 came from Jews. I'll say it again. Most of the money that Kennedy got in 1960 came from Jews. I'll do even better than that. They came through Abe Feinberg. Kennedy approached Feinberg early on. He said, I need your help. And Feinberg got together a whole bunch of well-to-do Jews. And they said like this. They said, we want to have control or input, decisive input in your Middle East policy when you become president. He was very outraged at all this. But in spite of his outrage, as we will see, he somewhat accommodated this. Kennedy was an aristocrat, son of a millionaire whose parents gave him a Harvard education. And if you know who he was, he went around the world many times in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. You understand what I'm saying? He was a young man. He was the son of an ambassador to England. He was in Nazi Germany and in Soviet Union and all the other countries of Europe in the 30s because he's the type of guy who could afford to do it. He understood international affairs in a way that many didn't understand and had much more foreign policy experience than, let's say, somebody like Truman. But on the other hand, people like Atchison, who had experience in foreign policy, always considered Kennedy amateur because he wasn't realistic in his ideas. And like Obama, he came into the White House convinced that if America can kiss up to the third world, then we will win their affection, and that will help us in the war against Russia in the Cold War. This is a key element of Kennedy's foreign policy, and it wasn't true. He learned the hard way that every one of these countries, no matter where they're located, whether Asia, Africa, South America, or anywhere else, is totally motivated by their own perception of their own national interest, just like everybody else. And it had nothing to do with whether you're pro-third world or pro-colonialism or any of that kind of stuff. They were just looking what is good for them. In other words, many think that the poor are virtuous. Not necessarily. They're poor. You see? If they have power, they won't be good. Rousseau postulated that the poor are righteous. But that's not actually true. And same thing in the world. Small countries are small countries. They're not good because they're small countries. They're just small countries. If they have the power, they'll be bad. You see? And presidents like Kennedy had to learn this at first hand. Now, he was firmly committed, as a matter of enlightened thought, to a policy of nuclear non-proliferation, even though, as we saw, France had just gotten an A-bomb, but countries like Britain, France, and so forth, you can't do anything about. That was the attitude of the United States administration. But the other countries, small countries, if they start getting atomic weapons, the world will become a much, much more dangerous place, which was true. You can't fault him. I want to tell you the honest truth. Ben-Gurion believed this also, except that Ben-Gurion said like this: Israel special. Shiny Hocha. We went through a Holocaust. This is this unusual case. You understand? In general, we're not in favor of everybody getting A-bombs. Just we should have it. Now, I'm trying to tell you. Now, Israel, when Kennedy became president, therefore, was in the middle of a crash course to get an A-bomb by 1962. In the event, it didn't happen. They got it in 1966, as we'll see. But this is the way the infrastructure and everything else was working out. And here you have a clash about to happen because the new president owed the Jews support for Israel. At the same time, he didn't want to support Israel in a way that would hurt, as he saw, American national interests. He resented the Zionist influence in American politics, even though he himself was a beneficiary of it. I might remind you that he barely won the presidency. If you want to get down and dirty, he didn't win the presidency. Many will remember that he won by 100,000 votes, which were stolen in the Cook County of the Daley. Remember that, Mayor Daley and all that? Those who are old enough to remember will know this. And he was quite aware of this. And so he had to tread very carefully. But one thing he was committed to with a passion was nuclear non-proliferation, and Israel does not need an A-bomb. So he was very resentful of what he could tell already were Israel's efforts to cheat. And early on, right in January of 30th, he became president January 20. January 30th, the State Department, Dean Russ, the Secretary of State, was already giving memoranda saying, what are we going to do about Israel? And Kennedy said, we're going to do something about Israel. And they let them know right away that if you say, Ben-Gurion, that this is a textile plant, or by that time he wasn't saying it's a textile plant anymore, by that time he had switched, and Ben-Gurion said, I guess, this is a plant for the peaceful exploration of atomic energy. After all, Israel needs desalination, Israel needs other water carrier type situations, agriculture. Listen, we're all in favor of peaceful atomic energy if it can be used properly. Even America was in favor of that. And so that's all it's for. And so Kennedy already adopted the following position. We want international inspection, or at least American inspection, of Dimona. And Ben-Gurion didn't want this to happen, but I can tell you right now, I'll just skip to the heart of the matter. Ben-Gurion said, I guess, maybe once, and we control where you go, all the rest of it. And that's not what Kennedy had in mind. Kennedy said, I guess, no, it won't convince the world, and it won't convince me, that this thing is peaceful unless we have a steady, constant inspection regime, such as you and I are familiar with, that the United States insisted on with Saddam Hussein, which Obama tried to insist on with Iran. The whole debate we just had in this country over the Iranian treaty was precisely over the nature of the inspection regime. And is it robust? And is it real? And can you rely on outside inspectors? And I remember the pro-Israeli side said that the Iranians have 24-hour notice, and they can cheat and all the rest of it. Well, this is what Israel did. And so Kennedy was no fool, and he said, I guess I want every month or every 6 months or every 3 times, 4 times a year. And the reason he said it's like this: when you go over and over and over again, eventually you can't cheat. You understand? They'll pick it up, which is true. If you send in a bunch of physicists and others, and they don't get it this time, they'll get it the second time, they'll get it the third time, they'll get it the fourth time. They'll be able to take samples from the soil, whatever, all of which was true. So a great tension developed between Ben-Gurion and Kennedy. Most of us don't even think of Ben-Gurion being the prime minister during the Kennedy administration. We think of him being the prime minister during Truman's time. But Ben-Gurion was in power for 15 years. And he was the president of Israel, prime minister of Israel at the time that Kennedy was the president of the United States. And they didn't fit together generationally, and they didn't fit together in personality. Ben-Gurion totally respected Eisenhower because Eisenhower defeated Hitler, was the commander in World War II. This gave him an extraordinary prestige. But he saw Kennedy, and as he put it, he said, the guy looks like a boy, like a high school movie star, and, the empty suit, as they say, and, his father bought him the presidency and all the rest. He didn't see anything particular in there, which isn't fair to Kennedy. To be honest, he was more than just an empty suit. But on the other hand, he certainly wasn't as substantial as he felt he was, and as his admirers obviously felt that he was. And so a clash was on there. Now, Kennedy from day one was determined to stop Israel. He filled his administration with State Department types. If you read the people that Kennedy appointed to the assistant secretary positions in the Middle East and all that, and the ambassadors to the various Middle East countries, they all have the same names. There's 3 names followed by the third, And they all went to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Andover. Notice white Anglo-Saxon Protestant State Department types, all of whom are therefore going to be not pro-Israel. Okay? I might even add that he sent exactly that type to Israel, Walworth Barber, the name will tell you, who was a graduate of Andover and Exeter and Harvard and all that sort of thing. Total State Department types. As we'll see in the case of Walworth Barber, he fell in love with Israel. But this is very unusual. That was not part of the scenario. Now, on the one hand, therefore, Kennedy conducted or staffed his foreign policy bureaucracy for the Middle East in that way. On the other hand, he was exquisitely aware of the importance of the Jewish vote. As I told you, he barely got in, and his money came from mostly liberal Jews, and he certainly didn't want to seem to be anti-Semitic, and so consequently, Kennedy and his brother and Feinberg all knew each other, and whether the Kennedys resented the relationship or not, Feinberg was a power broker behind the scenes. Abe Feinberg, I will remind you from last year, was a very remarkable guy. The very fact that he's behind the scenes shows he was a power broker. The guys in the front don't really count. It's the ones in behind. The Jewish guy from New York who, his father has made ladies' hosiery and raincoats and that sort of thing. And he got into business, when he got out of high school. And when he took over the business, they did well, and he became a millionaire in the 30s and the 40s. Especially, they got some Army contracts like people did in World War II. The last I heard, the Army also needs raincoats and shoes. You understand? I remind you that there were 12 million men and women under arms in World War II, which means there was a bonanza for anybody who was in the clothing business, and that's how they became rich people. He already was a Jewish Jew, and already in the 40s he realized the Holocaust and all this stuff was going on. He became a committed Zionist because like many people at that time, they said, so what's the solution? We have to have a country of our own. He wasn't one of these people. This is just an interesting story. He wanted to rise in the Jewish world and get to be hobnobs with the president and all these other people. The people from the Associated and the federations, they say like this: you got to wait your turn. First you start at this level, then you join this committee, then you do this, and then you do this. You know how it goes over there, which means the old guys want to hoard everything for themselves. That's true today like it was then. Now, he's a businessman who made the money on his own. He said, ich pfeife auf the ganze Welt, as they say, and I'll do it myself. And so he wanted to get in with Roosevelt, but how are you going to do that? It's not easy. And so what he did was, he said, yes, let me talk to the head of the Democratic Party. He just switched the heads of the Democratic Party, Robert Hannigan from St. Louis. There's a famous incident where James Farley, who had forever been the Postmaster General, was Roosevelt's political head of the Democratic Party. Now he switched it for a seasoned politician, an Irish Catholic guy from St. Louis, Robert Hannigan. Robert Hannigan, now listen to this closely, in 1944, was in on the secrets that others didn't know. And he says to this guy, Feinberg, who obviously must have given him a check for $20,000, $30,000, for serious money. He wasn't going to waste his time with the Associated. And he said like this, he says, I want to get to see Roosevelt. And Robert Hannigan said, in 1944, he says, why are you wasting your time with Roosevelt? I want to introduce you to Harry S. Truman. And he said, who's he? He's going to be the vice president. He says, I'm not interested in the vice president. I want to go to the top. He said, take it from me. I know what I'm talking about. Soon Truman's going to be the president. The public doesn't know how sick Roosevelt is. You see it? You hear this? And he says that, he saw that even though he was the vice president, the Secret Service was watching him like a hawk, which means the people who in the know knew. You get it? Now you and I know, when we look back at Roosevelt and the medical history has come out, he was a dying man when he ran for the fourth time and was elected. And which is why he died from a big stroke not long after he got elected. So this guy got friends with Truman before Truman was Truman. And therefore he was in from the bottom, from day one of the Truman administration. And in 1948, this is part of a legendary American history, he was the only guy who raised serious money for Truman. When Truman was running, you may remember, Dewey beats Truman. That's because all the newspapers, everybody expected he's going to lose, and therefore nobody normal would give him money. Nobody normal would give him money. Beyond, a small pro forma check. And serious money, Feinberg went to the White House. Oh, he says, I'll raise it. And he raised, a fortune. And when the election was over, so Truman was a politician, if there ever was one, from St. Louis, from Kansas City, And Truman said like this, I'll make ambassador to Israel. As a word, and Abe Feinberg said, yes, I prefer to work in the background. And by the way, the ambassador that they had, James McDonald, who was not Jewish, was a better friend of Israel anyway. But you can make my brother a federal judge. I wouldn't mind that. And that's how his brother became a famous judge on the Second Circuit, federal judge. This is how it works. And consequently, during the rest of the Truman administration, if they ever needed something really, 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 around the back of Atchison and others, you call Abe Feinberg. And so this is, as we talked about Eddie Jacobson, but this is more. And this is how the life works. And then the Democrats fell out of power when Eisenhower was elected. So for 8 years, he didn't have access to the White House. But now, as you know, in 1960, Kennedy was running. Kennedy was a Catholic. It was going to be a close call. And now he's in there, and he didn't have to say anything. He's going to have, if he calls the President of the United States, they will answer the phone call. Let's put it that way. This is how it works. And so what happened was that Kennedy said, I'm not going to give you control of my foreign policy, but I will give you a special sensitivity on it. And he did it in a very funny way, very Kennedy-esque way. He appointed a member of his staff, a Jewish guy, Mayor Feldman, who was a Jewish guy from Philadelphia, graduate of the University of Penn Law School. In other words, he had a good education, and he had become a member of Kennedy's staff when Kennedy was starting to think about running for president. Kennedy needed a prominent Jew or two in there to show he's not anti-Semite. And he was a close member of the Kennedy Council. When Kennedy got elected in November of 1960, he called this guy in and he said like this, you're going to have a special office in the White House, and your job is to take care of Israel. In other words, you read all the State Department stuff, all the CIA stuff, and all the Defense Department stuff that's negated to the Middle East, and if you see something about Israel, you can do something about it, bring it to my attention, all the rest of it. And Mayor Feldman said like this, I'm not the right guy for this because I'm a Jew, I'm pro-Israel. He said, you idiot, that's why I want you. You understand? This way you're really working for two people. You're working for me, you're working for Abe Feinberg. This is quite a remarkable situation. And the State Department and the others knew they just have to put up with this. And all this was away from the public scenes. None of us heard about this when Kennedy was president and all that, but this is the way it ran. And indeed, I want you to understand what I'm saying. Every State Department cable and CIA junk and all the rest of it that eventually came across the president's desk, first in the staffing process, was seen by this guy, Mike Feldman. You understand? If he underlines something, brings Kennedy attention, he says, oh, this is really going to be bad, or whatever like that, it would get traction. And that means that the ambassador and the diplomat and the others know they better watch what they write. That's really the point of all this. You understand? You better watch what they write. And so therefore, what's the right word? It's like a freezing, chilling presence. That's the word. A chilling presence. Now, the State Department was rather anti-Israel at this time, but they were aware of the political realities. Dean Rusk was the Secretary of State, and he had been Truman's Assistant Secretary of State when over the objection of the State Department he recognized Israel, so he understood what's happening in Washington, D.C. Like Obama, as I told you before, Kennedy persuaded himself that he wants to be extra sensitive to the third world, but he came to understand through his dealings with Nasser that this is baloney. You understand? Kennedy engaged in an extensive correspondence with Nasser to try to win him over, but things got worse as the Kennedy administration went on, especially when Nasser invaded Yemen in 1962 with 75,000 soldiers to put up a Nasserist government in place of the imam that was there before. Now, my friends, look how perspectives change. History is wonderful. The past is always changing. At that time, they thought it's going to be terrible. Now, I'm going to tell you exactly what I mean. At that time, everybody, Israel, America, they thought, oh, the worst thing in the world is if Nasser-type people take over Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Today, we say, yes, I wish it would have happened. Then we would have the Wahhabis and the jihadists and all this other junk. You understand? Look, even character Welt. You think you know what's right, but you have to wait a half century to figure out whether you were right or not. Which is why Chou En-lai was so correct when they asked him, what does China think of the French Revolution? They asked him this in 1970. He says, it's too early to tell. You see? Because the Chinese been around for a zillion years, and he was. You understand what I'm saying? You know, you have to see how these things play out. From our perspective today, it would have been better if Nasser took over these countries and secularized them, or whatever he did over there, and deprived the radical Islamists of their power. But this would happen at that time, and all this made Kennedy very angry and disbelieving in Nasser. That's the point I'm getting at. But that took time. From the day of inauguration, he worried about Dimona, as I said before. Ben-Gurion tried to delay, to blow it off, but it won't work. He makes it clear that he will not meet with Ben-Gurion until Ben-Gurion allows American scientists to inspect Dimona and make sure nothing is happening. Ben-Gurion agrees, very reluctantly, to two scientists, Americans, not anybody else, coming in April of 1961. The American scientists came there, a physicist and another expert, and Ben-Gurion said, I guess, we run the visits. So basically he said, what's behind this room? This room is off limits, that sort of thing. They put up a false front here and there. So they did a whole bamboozle operation. And then Ben-Gurion said, I guess, Yaitse. Right? They had the inspection. And a month later, in their only meeting in May of 61, do you have the next? Yeah. This is the one meeting that Ben-Gurion had as president, before that they met. Kennedy disabuses Ben-Gurion. He said like this: this is only the first of many inspections, because we hold correctly there was multiple periodical inspections, the cheating will be exposed, and that will discourage Israel from cheating. That's in a sense what he said. That Ben-Gurion, this is wonderful, Ben-Gurion said like this: Mr. President, I can assure you the woman is without sin. Okay? And Kennedy says, I believe you, Mr. Prime Minister. However, it is not enough for a woman to be virtuous. She must be seen as being virtuous. Good boy. Now, I don't know why you waste your time reading fiction. Who could make this up? Ben-Gurion then said like this: look, let's be frank. We aren't making an atomic bomb. But if the Russians give one to Nasser, or if Nasser dwells by himself, Israel cannot afford to be behind him. So he was hinting. He said, we don't want a bomb, but we want to get close to it in case it's necessary to close the gap. You understand? But Kennedy doesn't play with hints. He said, look, I'm not into no nuclear weapons. Get straight. This is America's position. Nothing. Now, Kennedy is aware of the politically delicate nature of confronting Israel over this. He wants to pressure it. Obama is now in a different climate. The world's anti-Israel, so he can be more tough. Kennedy was in 1961 when the world was still pro-Israel, the Western world, therefore you had to watch yourself more. He wants to pressure Israel without appearing to do so to his Jewish voters. So accordingly, all through 61, 62, and 63, he constantly sends Mike Feldman, not a State Department diplomat, to negotiate with Ben-Gurion and company. So Feldman went through 20, 30, I don't know how many secret visits. They would go to Israel, off the record, and he would press Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir and the others, said, listen, there can't be any nuclear weapons, we want more inspections and this, and that, and the other, keeping it out of the public and sending a Jewish guy to do it, and a pro-Israel Jew to do it, was his way of sending, look, we don't mean Israel anything bad by this, okay? We don't mean, but we're for you, but we are, as a matter of American policy, very opposed to this, and this would be bad for Israel. We wish you would see it this way. Now, so it's a clever, tricky kind of situation. All during 1961 and 62, Kennedy keeps asking Ben-Gurion for more inspections, and Ben-Gurion keeps blowing him off. Kennedy was slowly smoldering. On the other hand, you can't say that all he had in time to do was take care of Israel. Kennedy had his hands full in 1961-62. You remember these guys? Right? The world was going crazy at that time. And so Israel wasn't on the front burner. Moreover, if you remember the Kennedy years, he had domestically a lot of problems over here, okay, with the civil rights crisis that was going on. And this was a time when they were killing people in the South, right? And, George Wallace and all the rest of it, the people like that. So the civil rights revolution was going. Kennedy had a full plate, as we might say, over here. Now, then there was the Johnson plan, which I'll talk about some other time, where Kennedy had a full court press to make Ben-Gurion take in all the Arab refugees. And then there was the Hawk missile issue, which we'll talk about in the future, where Israel was desperate to get some kind of high-level American weapons technology, which they didn't have. And Kennedy kept saying, tomorrow, maybe, And basically, if you get rid of the A-bomb, we'll give this. And so it was quite a situation over there. Now, I hope to deal with this in a future talk in a couple weeks. In 1962, Shimon Peres visits the White House to talk with Mike Feldman in the basement. He had an office in the basement of the White House about Israel getting the Hawk missiles. And this is part of the other American-Israeli issues that they were working out behind the scenes. So here's Shimon Peres in 1962 and Feldman. Kennedy hears that he's there, and he says, send him up to the Oval Office. Shimon Peres, who at that time was not so well known, but he was Mr. Israel Defense, correct? Ben-Gurion was defense minister, but by this time, Shimon Peres was number 2. And as I've told you many times, Peres was quite remarkable, an extraordinary person, especially in those years, in building up Israel's defenses and establishing relationship with other countries is just extraordinary. Kennedy called him in the Oval Office, as Peres says, in his famous rocking chair, because Kennedy had a bad back, okay? And he just fired questions at him. And he said, yes, Israel, what are you doing in Dimona? And we don't want this thing, and you promised that you're not going to make it bombs, and, America's going to be angry at you, and this, that, and the other. And Peres, who was like on the spot, all he could say was this, look, he just thought this up. He says, I'll just tell you one thing. Israel has no intention of ever introducing nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And Kennedy says, oh, that's a good formula. We really commit to that? So that's a wonderfully ambiguous phrase. You understand what I'm saying? That became the mantra afterwards of Israel. As a matter of fact, 2 years later, after Ben-Gurion was gone and Eshkol was in, the Mankal, the Director General of Eshkol's office, with Yaakov Herzog, he came up with the exact same formula on his own, even though that they said it over there. They said Israel will not be the first one to introduce weapons in the Middle East. And they asked him, Eshkol said, that's a good lie. Where did you get that from? He said, from Baba Sia. He says, you understand? No, he didn't. Each one of these says, I don't have less than half. Okay? Dakin's where it said, we won't be the first ones to make weapons in the Middle East. Well, at that time, things were so tense in the world, Kennedy basically was satisfied for the moment. Now, he had no intention of easing up on the demands for inspections of the moment, but he wanted to hear that Israel wasn't going to pop up one day and say, like many other countries, we exploded an A-bomb and ha ha ha. And so Peres was signaling to him that this was not at all Israel's intention. Then came something decisive in American and world history. In October came the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we came this close to a third world war. Listen to the speech that Kennedy's giving, and notice he said like this, If anything is shot at us from Cuba, we blow up Russia. Listen to this.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting, therefore, in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of...
You heard what he said. He says this will be a war. And as we know today, this is the closest they ever came to World War III. Which means that if... Now, I'm interested in how this affects Israel tonight. And is really sensitized, both America and Russia, to the danger of nuclear weapons. And as a result, they not only both backed off, but in the next 6 or 8 months, what happened? They made a nuclear test ban treaty for the first time ever. In other words, America and the Soviet Union and other countries agreed to ban a certain type of nuclear bombs and weapons and testing areas. Take a look at the next thing. Avril Harriman.
The Kremlin, fortress of communist doctrine, is the setting of an historic event, the signing of an atom test ban. It's a jovial Khrushchev who is on hand, along with UN Secretary General U Thant, for the ceremony. The big three representatives, Dean Rusk, Andrei Gromyko, and Lord Hume, signed for the U.S., Russia, and Britain. Most other nations of the world, with the notable exception of France, Communist China, and Cuba, are to sign later. Mr. Rusk's must be ratified by Congress, while Mr. Gromyko's acceptance is automatically binding on the Soviets.
You get the idea. So this was a breakthrough. The reason I'm sharing this with you is if it's 1963 and you're John F. Kennedy, you're hyper on the nuclear stuff. And understandably so. And so he turns to Israel, and in the glowing aftermath, JFK resolves to make sure Israel does not increase nuclear proliferation. He writes a very tough letter to Ben-Gurion where he said like this: we want to crack down on this, we want a continual inspection regime, and if not, America will cut off Israel. Use those words. So we'll cut off all the aid, and we'll become your enemy, not your friend. I mean, it was a very tough letter. And the toughest, that's, in my knowledge, that's ever been written. It was beyond Eisenhower's letter in 1956. And anyway, the letter, this is in June of 1963. I'm telling you this for a reason. The letter hits Ben-Gurion, or it's about to hit him, at a worst possible time, when he's hit from right, left, up, above, and below. He went through a whole bunch of crises in which his own authority was pounded in Israel. He's basically going through an emotional crisis, Ben-Gurion, who was 78, something like that, at the time. The Lavon affair was in full swing that I've talked about before. Then the German scientist crisis, which I'll talk about next time, when it was a whole thing of Nasser's getting an A-bomb and sending missiles against Israel. And Ben-Gurion had a big fight with his own Mossad and fired the guy over this. Then there's the Kennedy letter, and Golda Meir and the others were tearing at him. And the bottom line is he was under extreme pressure, and he got sick and tired of being prime minister. It made it not fun anymore. This is Ben-Gurion 63. The American ambassador, Walworth Barber, tells Ben-Gurion a day or two ahead, he says, Sunday morning after Shabbos, because, what do you call it? Shabbos, Barber goes to play golf in Caesarea. Okay, Ben-Gurion, this is a good story. Ben-Gurion had arranged that they should build a golf course in Caesarea. It was part of his plan to lure that Eisenhower should make a visit to Israel. And he's always in the news that Eisenhower was playing golf. So he thought he could bring him to Israel with a golf course. But anyhow, he says on Sunday morning, I'm gonna give you a letter from Kenny, and it's a hot letter. I'm just warning you beforehand. That just built up the tension, okay? It just built up the tension, and the result was that the day the letter is supposed to be given, June 16, 1963, Ben-Gurion resigned. He left office. The whole world was shocked. The ambassador was shocked. He's got nobody to deliver it to. There are even people who suggest that, Ben-Gurion resigned in order not to get the letter. That's not true, but it was a part of it. And all of a sudden, it's a new prime minister, and it's an entirely new tone. Okay? And as you see, Ben-Gurion used to say like this: the Jewish nation, Tzricha liot or lagoyim, and Eshkol used to say like this: Halavai shouldn't be choshech for the Yidden. Right? It's only sein finster for the Yidden. In other words, Eshkol had a much more limited set of hopes, a much more realistic, shall we say, a very different type of guy. He totally abandoned the vision thing, as we would say today. And anyhow, the point is like this. It's a new prime minister. It's going to take a month or two for the government to be formed and the negotiation party. So don't deliver the letter yet, and until everything's settled and signed. Here, this is the news announcing the new prime minister.
ביום ד' 19 לחודש השישי 63 קרא לנשיא המדינה והטיל עליי את התפקיד להרכיב ממשלה להגישה לכנסת ולקבל אמונה.
Okay, so this was a political revolution of the first order, as you might understand. So the letter was delayed until Eshkol was ensconced. But then the letter came. And Eshkol huddled with his staff and so on and so forth. And finally, they had no choice because they couldn't afford America to break off. And so they agreed to inspections to take place in December. Okay, they made a date. And he hopes the inspectors won't demand carte blanche. In other words, they hope the inspectors will follow the Israeli orders. But who knows? You understand? Because Kennedy said, I guess, enough fooling around. We've been playing around this for 3 years now. And enough is enough. We want to... And remember, Kennedy said like this: I'm doing this for your sake, so that the Arabs shouldn't get worried and make a bomb of their own. And anyway, it's against Israel's interests to have an atomic weapon. So Ben-Gurion was basically saying what many Israeli scientists were saying. They were saying what Golda Meir and many others were saying. Only Ben-Gurion had this monomania on Shimon Peres that we're going to have it. Now, this is what happened. Kennedy wrote back, because he was diplomatic, said, this is a good step, but I want to emphasize to you, Eshkol, it's only a first step. We're not going to let go of this. I really care about nuclear proliferation and get used to that. Okay? Now, Israel then switched into preparing very nervously for this trip, for this visit in December of 1963, but then, of course, came November 22nd of 1963. All right? Which we know the most extraordinary thing here. We have now a Jewish guy, by the way, was standing. Was standing. There's Kennedy, and just taking a stupid home movies, and he saw there's Kennedy getting hit, and then he even saw he get hit a second time. So there's no question what happened. This, of course, changed history, as we know, in many ways. And all of a sudden, to everybody's surprise, you have the next picture, new man in the White House. Okay? It was a shock to the world, of course. Some of us are old enough to remember it. But the question is, how did Israel see it? Okay? Now, Lyndon Johnson is one of the most extraordinary individuals to ever hit the White House. That's an understatement. He was a tremendous study in contrast. I would characterize Johnson as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. No, I mean it. As far as Mr. Hyde is concerned, I can't even say in a show how crude, how rude, how obnoxious, how unbelievable. You can't describe it. I mean, just to tell you one thing, you used to get on an airplane. First of all, he was drunk most of the time. None of us knew it. Second of all, I'm serious. The Secret Service now is giving all this stuff out. And when he got on one of his airplanes, he immediately took off all his clothes, right? For men and women there. And the crowds outside were cheering. He gave him the finger. The guy was crazy. You understand? In other words, he did other things and that's, by the way, if you can imagine, that's I can share with you. Imagine what I can't share with you. Okay? Okay, so Johnson was unbelievably crude and all the rest of it. But he's also was Dr. Jekyll. You can't deny it. Okay? Look, Johnson, say what you want. He made the civil rights. That's a fact. He broke racial discrimination in this country. He did it. I don't think any other politician could have done it. And the Civil Rights Act of 64, 65, 68, the kind of discrimination that was going in America. There were 2 toilets and 2 water fountains, all the rest of it. Johnson's the one that broke it forever. Okay? And not only that, look, he did the Medicare and many other things. I'm sure there are people here that benefit from the Medicare. Imagine what life would be without it after all the smiling and all the jokes are over. And that's just 2 pieces of his many legislation. So what I'm trying to say is like this. So he was a big idealist in a certain way. He saw himself as the heir of Franklin Roosevelt. What Roosevelt wasn't able to get accomplished, he's going to get accomplished. And as many may know, there never was such a sneaky wheeler-dealer politician like him. So he knew how to get through Congress what nobody else could get through. He knew how to blackmail all the congressmen and senators. But he said, I'm doing it l'shem shamayim. You understand? He's doing it to pass liberal and necessary legislation. And so here you have Jekyll and Hyde. And it's really quite remarkable. And if he didn't have the Vietnam, I think history would look at him quite differently. Now, anyway, what about the state of Israel? Here's a senator from Texas. And he told Shazar, went to the funeral of Kennedy, a famous line. He said, you lost a very good friend, but you just picked up a better one. That's what he told him. He said, you don't realize it, but you will. And the truth of the matter is that he wasn't lying over there. Johnson was a congressman for many years and a senator, but congressman in Texas, in Austin area. Very interesting population. Austin, in those days especially, Hispanic, Jewish, German, Irish. You don't realize, you think Texas, but actually it was a kind of Texas, more like Chicago, more like Brooklyn. You understand? And now I'm serious. He said he used to send out newsletters from the Congress office in Yiddish and Spanish and Polish and all this kind of thing. People don't understand this. Moreover, from early on, it's just an interesting story. Let's put it this way. You can talk about the remarkable Mr. Johnson and the remarkable Mr. Novodorsky. Shimon Novodorsky, who came to America and changed his name to Jim Novi and became, I'll tell you, listen to this. He's a Jewish guy who came to this country at the age of 17 from Poland in 1913. Listen to what I'm saying. From his father was a rebbe or something like that in a cheder or a school of some kind or other from a traditional East European Jewish family, as you understand. And he came here as a teenager in 1913. They didn't want him to go to New York, so they sent him to Galveston like they used to do. Keep him away from New York, send him to the south. So he got off the thing in Galveston. And immediately, what do you do in 1913? Remember, there's no Social Security, no unemployment insurance. This is the America of yesteryear. You make what you make through your own hard work. And so he starts peddling and buying and selling junk and things like this. And so he gets into the junk business, we would say today, which is scrap metal. And then World War I starts. And by 1915, he's already selling to the government. And by 1916, he's made a fortune. Seriously, the guy's not 20 years old yet. That was amazing, Not 20 years old yet. He made a fortune because of World War I. By 1917, 18, as the federal government got into war, you know what the kind of contracts was crazy over there, right? So the prices went high. After the war, of course, the junk business went boom. He goes into the movie theater business. which was the big technology of the end of the First World War. And he makes a lot of money in that. And then later on in the 1930s, go back in the junk business because he sees World War II is coming. And he made a fortune in World War II. So it's one of these situations which is not unique by any stretch of imagination. As I say, he's a Yiddish-speaking guy, came from the old country. He comes to, settles eventually in Austin, Texas. There's only a temple there. You don't feel right in the temple. So he founds an Orthodox shul, a good Asachim. Now when I say Orthodox, I mean like the old days. Not everybody was 100% observant, but that kind of thing. And so it's a Yiddish-speaking type of guy. He marries a girl named Shirley, And it's the truth. Shirley Feinstein. It's quite a story. And so here's a guy at the end of World War I in the 1920s and 30s who's living in Austin, which is where the state capital is, and is involved in business and local Jewish affairs. He's in the ZOA, he's in the B'nai B'rith, the type. Let's put it this way. The Associated goes after him. Right? And let's put it this way. He meets, at a young age, this very ambitious young Texas guy named Lyndon Johnson, who wants to have a career. And he's the one who gives him the first money. And not only that, he takes him around to B'nai B'rith to give talks, and the ZOA to give talks, and the synagogue. That's where you raise, and then you pass the hat. This is how Johnson got his political career. First, he was in a congressman's office, and then he got he ran for the congressman's position, and then the rest is history. You understand? And he was incredibly ambitious from day one. And there's a bunch of Jews in Austin, Texas, of all the godforsaken places. They're in one like this, and he became one of his close friends, to whom he shows the Dr. Jekyll side and not the Mr. Hyde side. You get it? With the Jews, he doesn't do the kind of crude things that you do with your friends. Okay? Now, it's also true that Johnson, this is a different America. Johnson was from a Jerry Falwell type family. Today, these guys would be Republicans, Tea Party. In those days, it was the alignments were different, and people could be machalik to differentiate between their religious beliefs on the one hand and their political stance on the other. You have people that are very big political liberals, right? At the same time, they come from a very Bible Belt type of background, and he certainly did. So it's just kind of interesting, this combination in there. You wouldn't expect somebody from Texas to be coming out of here, but that means that you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, you simply didn't take the trouble to do your homework. Let's put it this way. This guy who changed his name to Jim Novy, as it were, come very close with Johnson. In 1938, this guy says, my son's going to be bar mitzvah or something like that. He was 18, and I want to take him back to Poland to visit the old country. And he says that, and he tells his congressman, Johnson already, he says, I'm going to Poland. And Johnson says, are you crazy? The Jews in Europe should get out of there. Hitler's going to kill them all. And he said, well, I want to visit my relatives. How many relatives? You stupid? He says, I thought you were a smart businessman. How many relatives do you have in Poland? And he counts up the cousins. It's 42. 42. In Knizhin, in eastern Poland. And 42. And John said, like, give me the names, and I'm going to get them out. He said, well, you go over there. Now, I'm going to tell you something. You go over there. He said, I'm going to give you a passport for everybody. And, of course, what he did was wheeler dealer. He talked to the State Department. He wrote a letter to the thing. I'm a congressman. And, notice everything's done behind the back in the wheeler dealer Texas tradition. But the guy went over and brought all his relatives out. You understand? I'm not finished. And then afterwards, they did a thing. Look at this. This from the Wikipedia. I want you to read this. I'll read it for you. And was an undercover operation to relocate European Jews in Texas away from it. In 1938, Lyndon Johnson, congressman, later president, worked covertly to establish a refuge in Texas for European Jews fleeing Germany. People didn't know. Because he was a wheeler deal behind the scenes. You understand? Johnson helped hundreds of Jews enter Texas through Cuba, Mexico, and South America. And notice illegally. And by pulling stick. Because he knew the guy in charge of the customs at the Galveston was a cousin of his, and the guy in charge of the passports. You know how it works over there. In other words, he didn't say, I'm turning over the whole America, right? But just, I want you to think of this image. At the same time Roosevelt was sending the ships back, look at this. His influence, attitude, religion, his family, so on and so forth. Okay? I mean, you can get it yourself off the Wikipedia. You understand? And he did it with this guy, and there's more to it than even I'm telling you. And so people didn't know this. There's no way you would. But here's someone with a very close connection, you wouldn't expect, a very close connection to Jews from day one, and who helped him in his political campaigns and things of this nature. Johnson becomes therefore very close with Texas Jewry in general, in Austin and in Houston and in Dallas and those kind of places. Okay? I might remind you that Johnson went on to have this spectacular political career, became at a young age the majority leader in the Senate. And I told you last year, in 1956, when Eisenhower was boiling over, the Ben-Gurion fooled him and invaded the Sinai Desert. Eisenhower and Dulles at that time said, I guess we're going to cut off Israel. They were going to cancel the UJA and cut off all the money to Israel, which would break Israel like it broke France and England. And it would have been a disaster for Israel. They're going to make a boycott, in other words. And Johnson wouldn't let it. He went to Eisenhower. And he said, I'm going to stop you. And Eisenhower couldn't do anything about it because the Democrats had a majority in the Senate. Now, to be fair, the Senate minority leader, head of the Republicans, William Nolan from California, said the same thing. So Eisenhower and Dulles, to their great anger, were faced by the two leaders of the parties in the United States Congress in 1956. The Democrat and Republican, both of them said, yes, we're not going to touch Israel, which is why he didn't do it. So I'm trying to tell you that Johnson was a very like I say, there's a Mr. Hyde, but there's also Dr. Jekyll, and it ill behooves us as Jews to disregard that. That's my point. Now, so I'm trying to. This is Eddie Jacobson. You see where I'm getting over here, right? This was Eddie Jacobson over here. This is he went to Israel all the time to give these presents. As you can see, Ben-Gurion needs a cowboy hat like I need or whatever. But you want to know something? I'm sure they told Ben-Gurion like this. He's close with Johnson, so whatever. That's how it goes. I have to tell you this story. Maybe you saw it last year. Was online. His shul that he found was called Godes Achim. And it was Orthodox shul until 1948. Then it went conservative, which happened all over the United States. Correct? All over the country, the big push where Orthodox shul switched to conservative was in the 40s and 50s, especially 40s. And those shuls that I'm talking about that did that, most, not all, were quite traditional. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? The conservative shuls of yesteryear, not today, but shuls of yesteryear, they did switch to conservative. They had mixed seating and all that. That's true and all that. But on the other hand, they still were, Shabbos and the davening and a lot of the things they still, kosher, they still kept up, especially in those years. I'm talking 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, perhaps into the 80s. It's not like the conservative Judaism of today. Not that I'm saying it was great, but I think you understand what I'm trying to get at. So the Godes Achim, let's put it this way. Kennedy got killed on November 22nd, 1963. Lyndon Johnson went with him and was in the motorcade when Kennedy was killed. He was 2 cars behind. Now Johnson accompanied Kennedy for a number of reasons, like 5 or 6 reasons. One of them was that he was having a machlokes with this other guy, Senator Yarborough, and he wanted Stalmazoi the credit of being together with the President of the United States, showing off his own state, and this and that and the other. One of the reasons was because he had a date, Johnson, on Sunday, November 23rd, to speak at the Godes Achim, because they just relocated to a new building, and this was the dedication building. You understand? Now I'm going to tell you something to give you an idea what I'm talking about. He was so well known and so common a visitor to Godes Achim and those places that people didn't want to pay to hear him speak. Do you get what I'm saying? He said, Johnson, because they always hear him. And then the rabbi writes this of the shul, or the rabbi's daughter, I should say. And hold on. Now, obviously, the Sunday dinner was canceled because on Friday, November 22nd, Kennedy was killed. However, it was rescheduled for December 28th, 1963. Now, Johnson said like this. He says, I said, I'm coming. He says the first thing he did as president was to go speak at the Godes Achim. The first public thing he did was to go speak at the Godes Achim in Texas. No, I'm not finished. He says, they moved to a new shul. How did they move to the new shul? The old shul was located in, I guess, what would be a bad neighborhood, I suppose. And so the president, Jim Novy, and the others, they got Johnson This is so typical. Johnson, the federal government bought it for like 3 times what it's worth. That gave the show enough money to buy in the new place. You understand what I'm saying? And when they switched to Sefer Torahs, so I'm sure it's one of these old shows that had 20, 30 Sefer Torahs. How are they going to transport him? Johnson gave him the car. The vice president limousine. You understand? So in other words, it's not what people think when you just see somebody from Texas. So here you are. There's Jim Novy introducing the new president of the United States and making a joke and his wife and all the rest of it. And it's not like they don't know each other. There's a wonderful article, you can read about it online somewhere, where the ladies' auxiliary is working. There's no kosher caterer in Austin. But the conservatives will keep kosher. And so they made so much potato salad, they filled up these garbage cans with potato salad to do so. In 1964, all I'm trying to show you is, you see where I'm going, how's this going to affect Dimona? It's going to affect it big time. In 1964, we might recall, Johnson was elected president of the United States in a landslide, and who did he pick for his vice president? The number 1 pro-senator in the Congress, which is Humphrey. So basically, the AIPAC figured like this, we can go to sleep. Yeah, it's not true, right? There was a lot of... It cannot help. Now, hear me well. It cannot help, I don't care in the best circumstances, that there will be clashes and issues between America and Israel because they're 2 separate countries. But it does help to have in the White House 2 people like I just described. Now, look, all I can tell you is, I'm taking you back to another time. It's different times. Right? It's different times. Israel didn't feel the way now that they felt at that time. And finally, I haven't even touched on the subject of Lyndon Johnson and Abe Feinberg. Because during the 8 years that Eisenhower was in power, the top Democrat was Johnson. And so when it comes to financing for the Democratic campaigns, all the other stuff like this, so basically, LBJ and Feinberg are very, very tight. I mean, very, very tight. And I'm going to tell you something, and then you're going to listen to it. Nowadays, we live in a new world. And they put everything online, including the Johnson tapes. Remember Nixon, the trouble with the Nixon tapes? Nixon was copying LBJ. LBJ wanted everything to go in history. Wait a minute. LBJ was going in history, so he taped himself all the time. I mean, everything. And he had sufficient confidence that it won't get out till later, and so on and so forth. Nixon did the same thing, but Nixon was incompetent with his, what do you call it, the OT. Right? He didn't know how to turn it on, turn it off, and that kind of thing. I know this is true. This is true. And so Johnson, who was much smarter, I mean, when it comes to wheeling dealing, Nixon was like an amateur. Johnson invented it. And so, no, I'm serious. And he always, as you'll see in a minute, he always knew how to stay 1 inch inside the law. Get it? He's always in the law. He didn't do anything without talking to the lawyer, which is something Nixon failed to do. And I only mention this for the following reason. So we have all the tapes of Johnson. And little by little, they're putting them out online. And when they came out online, when they started coming out online and started to catalog them, as where's that book I put it here? Michael Beschloss has recorded now in these 2, maybe I didn't bring it in with me, in the 2 volumes of Johnson 63, 64, 65. Just look in the back under Abe Feinberg. You understand? And people, the historians, it's like this, who is this guy? You understand? They thought it's going to be Khrushchev, it's going to be Dean Rusk, which it is. It's going to be General Westmoreland. Where's Abe Feinberg? And I want you to listen to this. Here's just one conversation. I picked of many in February of 65. I'm going to tell you the background, and then you listen to it. Here's Johnson talking on the phone, as he did all the time, with this guy, and getting in, hardly letting the other guy get a word edgewise, which was his style. And basically saying like this. They wanted Golda Meir to come visit Washington. He didn't want Golda Meir to come and visit Washington because the Arabs would get angry or something like this. There was arguments over arms sales, that time to Jordan, Israel, and so on and so forth. And Johnson's attitude was, just shut up, we'll do it secretly, And Israel was unsure and scared, and he's telling this guy Feinberg, what do you guys want to do? Just tell me what to do, and I'll do it, That's all it is. But I can't do, every time I try to do this, all the Jews get together and scream about this, and Jim Novy's calling me up every 5 minutes, and so on and so. Now you think I'm exaggerating. Listen to this.
From understanding it, from understanding the Russians and everything else, and just say, now, Mr. Prime Minister, we want to accommodate you. Which route do you want? Do you want us out of here, or do you want us in?
It's talking about Eshkol.
And We're going to let you write the decision, but we want your name signed in it, and we want your people signed in it, and we don't want it laid on to a man from Johnson City.
Which is him.
Well, you know that...
Isn't that the way to do it?
Of course, you know certainly that there's nobody in this country or in Israel will ever take the position that whatever position you take is anything but in the best interest of the United States.
Well, I think if they...
I may disagree with them, but it's not motivated by being anti-Israel.
Well, I'm certainly not, and if anybody is pro, I am, and I want to work with them and want to help them. But I don't see the thing as they see it, and they're emotional. They see it right there on their border. They know the problems, and I think it maybe our people are not as may not be as wise. I'm willing to just follow. I like Eshkol. I got along with him fine. I got along with Ben Gurion fine. I spent a lot of time with him. And back when they were in real problems and they were getting ready to sanctions, I just came down here and said, hell no, that can't be. And I stopped it. But they fight among themselves over there, and I'm not going to get in the middle of these clashes and have one of them leak it on me that I want to join up with the Arabs.
Well, I gather that for proper diplomatic reasons, you think that Golda's visit here would be...
I just think it would. I think it would get to inflame the whole world. I think the Germans would wonder if she's coming to mess in that thing. I think the Arabs would say, "Good God, what's Johnson doing in here?" I think the Jews would all start sending telegrams. I think Jim Novy would have me on the phone from Austin in 5 minutes. And I think that
I think you get an idea of what I'm talking about, which I can't see this happening with Obama. No, I say that sadly. You know what I'm saying? It's because people didn't realize Johnson had an unusual, intimate, this is a behind-the-scenes, encounter. You heard what he said. He said, just tell me what it is that you want. I'll get on, but you guys are fighting among yourselves. You can't even, settle this whole thing. And finally, to do the Makah Patish, it was Johnson's closest Washington, D.C. friend in the world, which is his lawyer who advised him every move, had to always stay on one side of the law. And that was Abe Fortas, who I'll talk about in the future, but I just got to share this with you because everything's online now. And Johnson, as you may know, he bamboozled Arthur Goldberg to resign. I'll talk about it later. And then Arthur Goldberg was on the Supreme Court. He got him to resign by promising something. He didn't deliver. And then the seat was open, and he's going to appoint Fortas. Fortas did not want to be appointed to the Supreme Court. At least that's what he told him. And Johnson, this is a wonderful passage. Johnson calls up Fortas, and you'll see. So, like this, I want you to come down. I'm having a press conference today, and it's going to be very interesting. Now, what it means is he's going to appoint him as thing, but he doesn't tell him what's going on over here. Take a look at this.
Yes?
840, line 0.
Hello? How are you?
Okay, sir. How are you?
Fine. You going to watch my press conference today?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. All right. It's left for me to do it.
How's your blood pressure?
And what to say, Steve?
Well, anything I do will be all right on it. Well, why don't you come over here and watch the press conference?
Well, can I do that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, come on over and go down with Bert or Marvin or Jack or somebody at 12:25. I don't know what will happen or what questions or anything I'll get, but don't be surprised. Thank you.
This picture is when Fortas came over and Johnson, in his way, went away. He said, I'm appointing you to the Supreme Court. You understand? So, let's put it this way. It was a different regime than Kennedy. That's the point I'm hammering off with all this sort of thing. So now I'll bring this down to the final. As for Dimona, it was a new day. Johnson was committed to following the Kennedy policy of pressing for inspections because Kennedy had been clearly on record for that. Another inspection did take place in January of 1964, and a number over the following years, but under Johnson, the United States was not going to go out of its way to be not fooled. You know what I said? In other words, if Israel said, this is off limits, all the rest of it, they had orders already from the top, just let it go. The State Department and the Defense Department pressed Johnson to make weapons sales to Israel conditional on renouncing the A-bomb, which was Kennedy's position. And thus it was that in 1966, during Johnson's second term, Israel finally got its goal, and the first plutonium A-bomb rolled off production. There was no announcement or anything. Levi Eshkol, the prime minister of Israel, was very nervous about this. And Golda Meir was going crazy. He said, you can't fool the Americans this way. But he doesn't know how to tell them. And so finally, what ended up was that Eshkol told the most famous physicist in the world at that time, Dr. Strangelove, okay, otherwise known as Edward Teller, right? He's the model for Dr. Strangelove. He's the one who made the H-bomb, okay? He was always angry at Oppenheimer for only making A-bomb. He wanted to, I want you to understand who we're dealing with over here. Oppenheimer and all the other guys figured that the A-bomb would be used on Germany, which was wiping out the Jews, okay? And that you drop an A-bomb, it'll take out Berlin, correct? This is what the plan originally, I know it didn't turn out that way, this is the plan originally. Edward Teller, who was a Hungarian Jewish physicist genius, he said, forget Berlin, I want to take out Germany. You understand? You get it? This is who he was. And Edward Teller went to Israel twice a year, every year in the 1960s. Okay? And ostensibly he went to give a speech at the Tel Aviv University at the Physics Symposium. But in the evenings, he got together with Shimon Peres and all the other people off the way. There's a famous account by one of the children of, who was it, Munya Mardor, who's like this, I went with my father and mother to see a play or something like this. After the lights turned off, Edward Teller was brought in to sit next to my father because they weren't watching the play. You get it? So this is what was going on all this time. So you have America's number one scientist. I want you to understand what's going on over here. The father of the H-bomb, and he's the one twice a year in Israel. So Edward Teller was, as he put it, people asked Teller, who's your biggest teacher in life? From all the science. He said, my biggest teacher in life was Adolf Hitler. Okay? So he did not need a lesson in Israel, and he was in charge of Livermore Laboratories, which perhaps you know what that is, where they do the nuclear stuff. And if some scientist said, I'm against Israel, he fired him. So this was who Edward Teller was. So Eshkol tells Edward Teller, and basically it's like this, you break the news to the Americans. Edward Teller goes to America, and he sees Richard Helms, the head of the CIA under Johnson. And he said like this, he said, I'm off the record, but I'll tell you right now, Israel don't want to announce it, but they didn't tell me to tell you, but, I'm telling you, and they know I'm telling you, they did it. They got the H-bomb. Helms tells Lyndon Johnson. He actually told Carl Duckett, who was the head of the science department, and then he told Helms. Helms told Johnson in 1966. Johnson tells Richard Helms, who was the head of the CIA, don't share this with anybody, Russ McNamara or anybody else. Right? So Johnson says, I don't want anybody to know this. Which is extraordinary when you think about it. He wants the American government not to know what he was just told. And so consequently, the CIA didn't share this with anybody. And so it happened that the vision of Ernst David Bergman and Ben-Gurion and Shimon Peres came to fruition. In the end, Israel got to have its cake, and it got to eat it. Okay? And it's all due, I would say, to screwball circumstances, as it puts in the book of Mishlei, you can't, a guy like Johnson coming from Johnson City, Texas, that should be of this way, nobody could have predicted. Now, it fit like a glove into Israel. We would say, look at the Bible and look at the book of Mishlei. If you're an Arab, you don't see it that way. If you're an Arab, it's Pashut. The Jews bumped off Kennedy and put Johnson in so they could get A-bomb. And if you think I'm kidding, take a look at this. Here's Bassam Abu Sharif, who's like number 3 in the PLO. I want you to look at this.
قتل بن-غوريون كينيدي بسبب قرار كينيدي وضع مفاعل ديمونة تحت الرقابة لمنع إنتاج أسلحة نووية.
أصبح بن-غوريون هو الذي قتل كينيدي الآن؟
بن-غوريون أصدر أمر باغتيال كينيدي وأنا مسؤول عن كل كلمة. وتحالفت الموساد مع المافيا الأمريكية. وبعد ما أوزوالد قتل كينيدي أرسلوا له موساد اسمه روبي يهودي قتله، وقتلوا الموساد 22 شاهد من الشهود وأغلق الملف. وأنا
هو ما زال مغلقا لحد الآن.
أتحدى أن ينشر الملف. لحتى الآن رغم مرور السنين ما نشر بضغط صهيوني يهودي. أنبه أكرر أنبه الأجهزة الأمريكية التي تنام كالCIA والFBI بأن هنالك مخطط ماشي على الأرض لاغتيال أوباما، وأن المجموعة التي ستحاول اغتيال أوباما هي مجموعة يمنية باسم القاعدة، ولكنهم يهود يمنيين دربتهم.
هذا كلام من أين استقيت هذه
أنا
المعلومات؟
بعطيك خبر مالكيش على
من أين استقيت كل هذه المعلومات؟
أنا حر،
يعني
أنا مسؤول عن
هل تملك كل أسرار الكون بسام أبو شريف؟
أنا مسؤول عن كل كلمة أقولها، وإذا مهتمين يجي يسألوني.
I will close by saying this is the same group that says Israel shot the 13-year-old and killed him. Okay? It's the Middle East. They lie. What can I tell you? Good night.